for your introduction. I was quite amazed to hear all the things I've been involved in, but I have been working for many, many years now, so that's the explanation. As you said, I come from the Copenhagen Business School, where I've been working for all my life, so to speak. I first worked for 3 decades at the linguistics department, mainly on comparing the Danish and French language, texts and cultures. And lately, I've been attached to a sociological department of management, politics and philosophy. And these 2 different working and research environments have deeply influenced and permeated my research on humor, as you'll see as we go along. And I've chosen this title, National Humour, a question of humour socialization with a big question mark, and below, a comparative approach to the study of Nordic humour. I should have put another question mark after that line too. Because what I've tried to do is to see if the concept of humour socialization can be transferred to the description of national humour to a kind of regional humour as the Nordic humour. I'll start with this picture because it relates to our conference and to my speech today in different ways. First, it is a picture to the left I'm focusing on. It's a drawing by Storm P, whom we were acquainted with yesterday, and it's supposed to be a picture of a Danish philosopher and psychologist, Harald Høfting. And I chose it because, as it says here in the text, I hope that in my speech I have cast a little light over the concept of humor. And I think the humor here is, of course, in the semantic incongruity between the text about humor and the very dull-looking person. On a more personal and emotional note, I often sympathize with this tired and bored-looking person when I have to theorize about humor instead of just using it. But most importantly, he wrote the book on den store humor, the great humor, which have inspired me enormously for my work on humor socialization. And I shouldn't call it my work on humor socialization. My work was on Danish humor, and I found out that it was so special, not for us, but for everybody else. So I finally, after many years of studies, arrived at the concept of humor socialization. So actually it is the other way around. First I put the question, why are Danes not as funny as they think they are? And finally I arrived to that concept. So I should use that concept as a tool here to cast light on the first question I raise up here. Is there national humor? And if so, can it be explained with the concept of humor socialization? But let me start by telling you how I got to this concept. In 2008, I embarked on a project on humor, which turned out to be more far-reaching and comprehensive than I expected. It sent me in totally unpredicted and surprising directions. Being a linguist focused on researching the French language compared to Danish, I set out to compare Danes and French use of humor. And working for decades at a business school, I restricted my object of research to humor used in international professional settings and work situations. So I really delimited my object of research. I further restricted my study to spontaneous use of humor in conversations, in otherwise serious conversations, discussions, professional negotiations, and so forth. I had the confident and, as it turned out, rather naive working hypothesis that humor would act as a positive mediator between the two otherwise culturally very different groups, Danish and French people in work settings, business people, employers, employees, and so on. I anticipated that a touch of humor could and would relax an otherwise goal-oriented and maybe tense professional atmosphere, and that humor could contribute to binding and bonding Danish and French colleagues in a positive relationship, which again, at a later step, could facilitate their professional cooperation. So, great was my surprise when I learned from my Danish and French interviewers that this positive and soothing effect of humor was far from evident. Indeed, both groups pointed out having problems in understanding each other's humor. The French found Danish use of humor childish and gross and not funny at all, whereas the Danes judged their French counterparts as arrogant, self-important, and slightly condescending. If there are any French here, excuse. This result led me to expand my research to compare Danish humor with a wider group of nationalities. I included interviews from 14 different countries, such as US, Germany, Spain, China, Latvia, Serbia, Singapore, Great Britain, and others. They represented different work settings, this time including, first of all, politicians, namely Danish, French, and German members of the European Parliament. And later, I also included international students from CBS. The responses from these new groups were very much in line with what the French had told me, thus confirming that Danish use of humor in professional context is generally, and by other nationalities, perceived as, and I quote from the interviews, in your face, blunt, direct, hurtful, rude, and even traumatizing. That was a very sensitive French person. In my view. Only on second thoughts, much later, when prompted by my question, tell me about your first experience with Danish humor, were the events categorized as probably being meant to be humorous. I shall give you one example of such a snappy and direct remark from a Dane, as reported by a Chinese student at CBS. He was sitting next to a Danish student who had been elected as his Danish buddy, his Danish mate. The Chinese made the first move. He offered up to his Danish companion this sympathetic and contact-seeking remark. I've heard that Danes are the happiest people in the world, he said. The Danes' response was prompt. That's because of excessive use of alcohol and sex. This response left the Chinese stunned. He later described his own reaction in these terms. I was very surprised. I would have preferred a more discreet and restrained form of humor. Maybe because I'm from a country with a tradition for censorship and reserve. These statements from different nationalities all pointed towards the same particular features of Danish use of humor, as being rude and crude and excluding, whereas the Danes themselves judged themselves to be innocently and harmlessly ironic and self-ironic. And they saw themselves as friendly and including. So this leads me towards the notion of national humor. These empirical findings inspired me to look more into the notion of national humor, especially as other statements confirmed the existence of such a thing. The Danes, for instance, in general found that the French are arrogant, Germans and Swedes are boring. I'm sorry, it's not me, it's the interviewers. Italians are wacky. Other nationalities characterize their own humor and that of their countrymen in terms like these. A US student explained that his and his countryfolk's humor was masculine because it tends to put others down. A female Spanish student observed that Spanish humor is unfortunately often sexist, and another respondent from China stated that his countryfolk are competitive by nature and often ridicule others in order to elevate themselves. So we have certain hints of there being a kind of a sort of national humor. And the concept has been discussed at length in humor studies, for instance by Alfred Sief, who in a book on national styles of humor compare 8 different countries. And he has some remarks which I think are interesting. The first is, he first talks about the universal aspect of humor. Humor is a way of expressing human needs in a socially accepted manner. That's very important. What is socially accepted in one country may not be socially accepted in another one. And he continues, the national aspect, because humor reflects on the nation's life, differences among national forms of humor can be expected. And he points to the role of language and history, saying, languages differ, but history and tradition also create differences. It's interesting, but unfortunately, Steve, the author, never really uses these key insights to look further into the differences created by language and history. And that's what I'll try to do. But before that, let me emphasize that one has to handle the concept of national humor with extreme care, because it easily lends to cultural cliches, stereotypes, and prejudices. Anyway, intrigued by the results of my investigation, I set out to look into what may have caused Danes to use humor as they do. I wanted to explain why these particular Danish ways of using irony and self-irony in work context where they come from. In fact, I searched for a systematic explanation that does not stop at the rather vague term of cultural differences. It often stops there. It's because of cultural differences. But I wanted to try to dig deeper. So, now I've come to these explanations that I arrived at, and how I came to the notion of humorsocialization. And I hope that by telling you about this, I can pave the way toward a method for analyzing other examples of national humor, and thus compare people's use of humor across countries and across languages. My aim is, as I said later in my talk, to see whether this tool can help us move from talking about a national humor to saying something interesting about a regional humor. Here Nordic humor as compared to the rest of the world. Quite a mouthful, and it can of course only be in a speculative vein. So, let me concentrate on humorsocialization and start with this definition, which, as I said, I arrived at the end of my book. You can read it. Stuff. So, what I point to is language and society. Let me tell you about, say something about the method I used to get to that notion. As I said, I started with collecting empirical evidence via interviews and questionnaires. Along with that, I plowed my way through a considerable amount of literature. First of all, naturally, literature from humor studies, which I combined with literature from linguistics, my original research playground, and with sociology, my current research setting. What links these 3 disciplines, in my mind, humor studies, linguistics, and sociology, is the dynamic dimension which I found in each of them. Such a dynamic dimension, something moving, something developing, was already present in my delimitation of humor to spontaneous conversational humor, since conversation in itself is an ongoing process, in which the humorous events changes the relationship between the participants from a before the event to an after the humorous event, in an either positive or negative direction. I expected the humorous event to be a positive, to create a positive effect, but it didn't in my studies, in my empirical studies. I found a parallel dynamic dimension in humor studies, namely in the evolutionary aspect of how a person's general attitude to humor is formed. And I found it in sociology, in the description of how a national mentality is gradually molded. And I also found an equivalent in linguistics, first in pragmatic descriptions of universal rules of conversation, and second in semantic analysis of language-specific ways of signaling humor. So this is the model, so to speak. I have humor studies at the top, where I look for what creates a person's humorous attitude, language, what is general in language, in conversation about humor, and what is specific for a specific language, and how do we describe society in a way which fits with the other two elements. Now I'll just give you a brief idea of the main train of thoughts that led me to link these two disciplines and subsume them in the notion of humorsocialization. You will find the details in this book, as already mentioned, and in the other one, which Mari showed you. And the first one, the green one, is a sort of academic explanation and description of my method and results and so on. And this is supposed to be a more funny and academic light, easygoing presentation in English of the same ideas but in another way. So let me take each of these parts first, and I'll start with humor socialization. I'll start with humor. I'll concentrate on one book within humor studies, namely Harald Høffding's before mentioned book, Den store humor, the great humor. Høffding explains how a person's individual attitude to humor is formed during his or her upbringing. All persons are bred with humor specific to their social community and end up entertaining a specific attitude to humor. Thus, a person's great humor is formed in a three-step process. It's all Høffding explained academic light. It all starts with tiny humor, in Danish, den lille bitte humor, in the form of small playful episodes with parents and families, sisters and brothers, that stir episodes that stir pleasant emotions in the form of comfort, amusement and well-being. I just 1 hour ago heard a very interesting paper on humor i sagor. That was you. I børnebøger, humor i børnebøger. And that of course forms part of the breeding with tiny humor. This tiny humor slowly changes into patterns of humor behavior, into what Høffding calls den lille humor, the little humor. It develops when we join other social groups such as school, education, workplaces, clubs, etc. Someone also referred to Billig in a talk later this morning. Michael Billig. He's talking about learning and unlearning. In these new social groups, we learn what works and what doesn't work. So we unlearn certain habits and so on. We learn that we meet new human experiences, and we learn that by using humor ourselves, we help to keep our group spirits high and join in with relaxing the ambience. We feel that others in the group value us and that we belong. In the end, all our experiences with tiny and little humor combine to create our great humor, which is not only an attitude to humor, but a general attitude to life, according to Hüften. And this humor permits us to see, I quote Hüften, to see life as great and small at the same time. And, as he says, to maintain a distance between our delicate self and the harsh pressures of reality. So, that was the evolutionary aspect in humor studies, in one example of humor studies. So now I get to the next point, which is sociology. Now it's becoming really tough. When it comes to describing society and its influence on the creation of a national mentality, I've been very much inspired by the German sociologist Norbert Elias. In this book, he wrote it before, but here we have it, The Civilizing Process, History of Manners, State Formation and Civilization. Elias introduces the notion of a civilizing process, by which he means that the mentality of a certain people belonging to a certain country's society has been molded during and because of certain historical, social, economic, geopolitical, etc. circumstances. So, a national mentality is molded, and it is my point to see that there's a connection between a national mentality and a national humor. He especially, or in the start of his career, Elias, he had a very long career, as you can see. He wrote about the French court society, la société de cour. And I think his remark here about the court mentality, though we are not going to speak a lot about the French, he says, stylistic conventions, the forms of social intercourse, conversation, articulateness of language and much else, all these were first formed in France within courtly society, then slowly changed in a continuous diffusion from a social into a national character. I think there are many keywords here, and so the French mentality, in his terms, according to him, is formed from above, because all the conventions and rituals and hierarchy and ranks and all that has seeped down into the French society as a whole, and formed the French mentality. If we try to apply this kind of idea to our Nordic country, and here focusing on Denmark only first, and comparing Denmark to France, nothing could be further from the Danish mentality than the court mentality. Denmark has experienced a radically different civilizing process, heading in exactly the opposite direction. Subjected to totally different historical circumstances, Danes and their particular national mentality have, unlike the French, been molded from below, from the peasant society, into a horizontal organization with informal social intercourse and less elegant and subtle stylistic conventions. A difference in socialization, or with Elias's words, in civilization, which I claim also underlines the use of humor, which is indeed a type of social intercourse and produced in conversation, at least the humor I study. If we take a quick glance at Danish history, we see that Danish historians have described the formation of the Danish mentality as starting with the military defeat to Germany in 1864 and the drastic reduction of Denmark's territories from a big nation to a very, very small one. Danish political parties and other social players were forced to agree on radical reforms in order to survive as a national unit, not to be erased. This meant accepting compromises and agreements which again led Denmark to become a primarily consensual society based on solidarity and trust, and evolving in the direction of a welfare society. I would like to subsume this Danish mentality that grew out of this civilizing process in the metaphor of the Danish mentality being a campfire mentality. I can also show it by this picture, which I think subsumes very nicely that we are all sitting on the same ground, happily singing together, drinking tea or tea, cold tea out of mugs, etc., that we turn our backs towards the outer world, having a cozy time around the fire. And it's quite clear that using irony, snappy remarks, self-irony, which we use a lot, you can do that on safe ground in such a campfire society. You wouldn't be able to do it in a court society, because there you have to be observant of your rank and never to lower yourself, whereas we should never, in Denmark, put ourselves higher up. Yeah. And now I get to the third part, which is linguistics. Come on, soon. Yeah, come on. Within linguistics, I was especially inspired by theories about conversation, what is general about conversation, and how does it influence the use of spontaneous humor. So I'll briefly mention Grice's seminal article on logic and conversation, where he presents the principle of cooperation, as he called it, this cooperative principle, which is indeed fundamental for all conversation, because we expect the other to be coherent in what with what he contributes to the conversation, and we respect the same principle. And Grice said that this was a universal, general principle, rule or maxim. But it may not be as universal and general as that, because that's exactly what happens when non-Danes face a spontaneous, humorous remark in an otherwise professional context, because they're not expecting humor to arrive at that place in that way. So this general principle doesn't seem to work in this specific situation, because the incongruity is simply too big, because what the non-Dane expects and what the Dane produces in the conversation. What interested, here we have it, what interested me most, however, in linguistics were studies of language-specific humor warning signals. That is, specific signals, specific way of signaling what I'm saying here is just meant in fun. Yeah, don't take it seriously. The Danish language provides the language user with a series of very particular small trigger words that imply that the partners in the conversation, the I and the you, already share certain assumptions as to what is talked about. These devices consist mainly of small adverbs such as jo, vist, vil, nok, da, etc., which in a newer Danish grammar have been called small conversational adverbs or dialogical particles, because they guide the conversation or guide the dialogue. And as you see, these words are often very short, monosyllabic, and unaccented, which means that they are very difficult for non-Danes, speaking Danes, understanding Danish, to understand, to see, to hear, because they're so small. But they may be small, but they have a great, huge potential of meanings, actually. What characterizes them these tiny adverbs, is that they are deeply rooted in context and referring to context. In fact, they contain this instruction to the receiver. Go and look for the meaning yourself in the context and in your background knowledge. Very often, these small words also guide the receiver towards this conclusion. Take this with a grain of salt with a certain distance. A distance that might well be flavored with touches of irony and self-irony. These expressions are sort of embodied in Danes from their early childhood when they learn their mother tongue. And that's another linguistic theory about embodiment, how our mother tongue is embodied in our ways of talking and verbal behavior. So these expressions are embodied in Danes from early childhood, just like the episodes with tiny humor, and hence they may be tightly linked to humorous episodes from this early period. And they end up being part of Danes' instinctive and automatic responses, humorous or not, in verbal interaction. So let me finish this first round with another round of the alcohol and sex example. That's the example with the Chinese student and his Danish body. If the Dane had spoken in his mother tongue and his Chinese mate had understood it, it may easily have sounded something like this. Kineseren siger, danskere skulle være de lykkeligste mennesker i verden. Danskeren svarer, det er jo nok på grund af overdreven brug af alkohol og sex. Det er vist på grund af, det er nok på grund af, bare just such a tiny little word, and you can combine them in multiple ways, and they seem as nothing, but they do describe introduce a whole network of interrelationships between the speaker and the hearer. In this way, he could have and would have, if he had softened his rapid-fire reply and avoided the shocking effect. With these linguistic devices, he could have implied that he was being ironic, maybe even self-ironic. He could have implied that we young people here in Denmark, we have a lot of alcohol and we have a lot of sex, and that's why we are so happy. Really with a grain of irony. And as he was himself a young student, he may have included himself in the group of drinking young people and thus being self-ironic. But it's all very subtle, too subtle. So let me conclude this part by saying that I've found certain interrelationships and connections between our form of conversational humor. We have those conversational adverbs. You shouldn't read it like this, but as a big network. And we have the big campfire mentality, which is based on trust, solidarity, common ground, consensus, and so on. So I think there's a fine web of interrelations here. Now I'm approaching Nordic humor. And let me do that with this tool of humor socialization. Can we talk about a kind of regional humor which encompasses several countries who share certain aspects of their attitude to humor, who, in Høffding's words, have approximately the same great humor. With the populations of the Nordic countries have been subjected to the same process of civilization. I shall compare Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. So the question would be, have Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians been socialized in a similar way into the same great humor, into the same attitude and use of humor? The intuitive answer which comes first to my mind at least, is yes, since they have so much in common in their way of life, history, religion, and social structure. if we take language first, as far as language is concerned, one should also guess yes, since the three languages all belong to the same Nordic branch of the Germanic language family. They are of the same type, but with certain variations, of course, especially when it comes to how they use similar language structures and expressions. The three languages are considered mutually intelligible, but what about humor expressed in these languages? Will it also be mutually understandable? But it is very important when it comes to using humor, both in verbalizing and comprehending, is the existence in all three languages of these small conversational adverbs, which play, as I just showed, play a very important role as humor warning signals in Danish, spontaneous use of verbal humor. It is not sure, however, that these small words have the same meaning potentials and the Norwegians and Swedes use them in the same way and with the same effect as Danes. I don't know. We'll have to test whether there are similarities or differences in the frequencies of using these small words across the three national languages, and see whether these small words also function as humor warning signals in Norwegian and Swedish. It seems to me to be a perfect topic for research. Considering now the right leg of the model of Humorsocialisering, Nordic societies, we certainly have a lot in common on many parameters, especially when it comes to the social organization of our societies, trust, equality, consensus, welfare, and so on. We are also very close on parameters such as religion, education, way, and quality of life. However, though we share aspects of the so-called Nordic model, each of us has its own economic and social model, which is due to large divergences in our national historical circumstances. Without entering into these historical details, we can conclude with the words of Norbert Elias that the three countries have not undergone the same process of civilization. With this influence, the social norms of humor used in the three countries in general and in professional relationship in particular, might we expect there to be more differences than similarities? Unfortunately, I have no answer to that question yet. So far, I've just carried out a mini empirical study with evidence from two colleagues and acquaintances from each of my neighboring countries, Norway and Sweden. I asked them to evaluate their experience with Danish colleagues and their use of humor, and I report the answers here, one from each country. I don't know if you can see it, I hope you can. The Norwegian to the left is a CEO who has been working for many years with Danish managers, consultants, and colleagues in offshore, naval, and energy industries. The Swede is a university professor who had at that point been attached to a Danish university for 3.5 years. Both sets of answers are quite illustrative and instructive as to what the two persons perceive as similarities and differences between their national humor and that of the Danes. What is striking is the difference between the Norwegian and the Swede. The Norwegian has a very positive view of Danes that corresponds perfectly with how Danes see themselves and their humor. Whereas the second, the Swede, relates more disapproving feelings and reactions that are more in line with those of the non-Danes I interviewed in earlier studies. The Norwegian, and now I translate very fast some of the expressions in bold. The Norwegian appreciates Danish humor with terms such as Danes are kind and very professional. They're easygoing, well-behaved, and extremely efficient. Their tone is amicable, inclusive, and agreeable. They are not self-pompous, but still respectable. There's more understatement in Danish humor than in Norwegian. Turning to the Swede now, and now I know I'm on dangerous ground here, surrounded by Swedes as I am. Yes, I'm finished already. The Swede is more skeptical and points to quite undesirable and harmful features of Danish humor. He asserts that the palpable directness of Danes can be perceived by Swedes as a too close closeness. He also describes Danish humor as sarcasm and irony. He notes that Swedes might perceive this as face-threatening, as too much. For Danes, he thinks humor and sarcasm obviously keep the group together, a remark that makes me think of the campfire mentality. The Swede says that Danes and Swedes do have something in common, namely conflict avoidance. The fact that the Swede refers to Danes as being direct, too close, face-threatening and sarcastic may indicate that the conversational, small, humorous words so frequently used by Danes do not operate in Swedish as humor warning signals as they do in English. When it comes to the explanations, the two respondents refer to different sociological factors which we might relate to differences in processes of civilization. But of course, with a lot of precaution, given this very small corpus, one can say, given the individual idiosyncratic character of these two single statements. The Norwegian points to a culture stemming from trade and commerce and strong commercial relationships with, as I said, a norm of not offending each other. Indeed, Denmark and Norway have close historical relationships, both when it comes to being part of a national union and when it comes to trade and commerce. The Swede, on his side, emphasizes that consensus and group cohesion are very important for both Danes and Swedes, but especially important for Swedes, for whom it is more threatening to break consensus than for Danes. From the Swedes' perspective, Danes seem to have no need to put special weight on respecting consensus, since it is so obviously fundamental. Without venturing into the details of the historic processes of civilization characteristic of Sweden and Denmark, it is tempting in this last explanation to see a trace of the Swedish folkhemmet, which has played an important role in the history of the Swedish welfare state. The base of the folkhem vision is that the entire society ought to be like a family where everybody contributes and where everyone looks after one another. This idea, or this metaphor of the folkhemmet, differs subtly but still substantially from the metaphor of the Danish campfire society, in that the folkhemmet emphasizes respect and care more than the hygge, which is emphasized in the Danish coziness around the campfire. I know this is going into a minefield area here, but so I'm concluding now. I hope that I have given a hint that maybe the notion of humorsocialization does have a role to play in the definition of a Nordic humor, even though it certainly shows divergences across the borders. I think the Nordic countries probably still have more in common with each other in their way of humor than they have with non-Nordic countries. All this is, of course, only speculative, and I'll end here with Høfting himself, or with Storm P. I hope that in my speech today I cast a little bit of light on the concept of human socialization. Thank you.